episode, we're going to cover a deeply left-wing idea, freedom. We'll look at its history as a political concept and how what constitutes freedom, and who gets to claim it as their own, has been perverted in only very recent history. Under socialist organizations of the economy, the economic coercion seen under capitalist regimes virtually disappears, and freedom takes its place. This is a product of the more complete understanding of freedom on the left. Without poverty and an undemocratic economy standing in your way, you are free to live out your life as you see fit. Liberty and freedom are left-wing ideals. No matter how hard the global neoliberal consensus tries to convince us otherwise, there is no hiding this simple fact.
As a YouTuber, I constantly receive video requests from my fellow subscribers, usually centering on making video responses or refutations on particular videos or channels. However, I have constantly been requested by multiple subscribers to make a debunking video on a particular Marxist YouTuber who, if you are a follower of mine or have read the title of this video, know who I am referring to. J.D. Chapman, who goes by the alias Second Thought, is known for creating long, in-depth videos ranting on capitalism, the United States, videos defending communism, and sipping for authoritarian regimes. He is what we like to call a tanky, someone who is an apologist or defender of authoritarian socialism. I have previously mentioned him in a video a few months back in which I refuted a claim of his that the CIA was using Twitter bots to stir up a quote-unquote color revolution in Cuba. Since then, I've been looking around at some of his videos, and a lot of them I felt disinterested due to either the video being too long, or I felt that the subject matter wasn't interesting enough to be worthy of a debunking video. However, this was before I came across his latest video titled Liberty and Freedom Are Left-Wing Ideals, in which he expresses his complete ignorance regarding politics, philosophy, history, and even the concept of freedom itself. It's ironic enough that Second Thought is a Marxist-Leninist whose ideology is centered on repressing human rights via the iron fist of the tyrannical government to achieve a classless society. It should also be noted that just like Carlos Maza and Hassan Piker, Chapman is basically a millionaire living off his parents' hard-earned income to live a carefree lifestyle.
Now I'm going to do something I generally don't like doing. I'm going to talk about myself. As I mentioned before, I come from an affluent family.
Are you serious?
By the time I was old enough to have real memories, my parents were well established. I was given opportunities many others were not. I could attend private school, take extracurricular classes. I could get a tutor for math, which I was terrible at. I could take practice SATs to prepare for the real thing. When I went off to college, I had earned a decent academic scholarship, and I was able to attend a small private university thanks to a combination of the scholarship and my parents' affluence. To my parents' credit, none of their wealth is generational. I can certainly understand why people like my parents see the US as a meritocracy, when they did genuinely work very hard. But we cannot discount certain privileges that came with being a white male.
Mr. Conrad, you, my friend, are being audited.
And I'm not that type of person who judges someone's personal life, but I find it hilarious that Chapman has a second channel where he test drives Mustangs and Ferraris.
Excuse us, don't mind us, just coming through.
Just coming through in a $160,000 car that's more expensive than most houses are.
It's wild. All right, ladies and gentlemen, what's the car saying?
Car is lowering suspension.
Nice. If you can't tell by the fancy lowering suspension automatically and the loud noises coming from behind us, we are in a very fast and expensive car today.
We are in a McLaren 570S.
Very, very excited. I have never been in a McLaren.
Neither have I. This is my first time I've ever even set foot in a McLaren. It's the first time I've ever sat down in one or been in one or touched one. It gets obscene amounts of attention. Like, everybody thinks you're a celebrity.
Anyway, my response be broken up into several parts as his video is loaded with deceptive rhetoric, misinformation, and the usual factual inaccuracies that you would expect from a typical Marxist-Leninist. Funny enough, he begins his video by advertising his Patreon because we all know that tankies have to live in society.
This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought.
Oi, you! Shut your mouth and look at my wad!
Chapman starts out by lambasting the Republican Party for capitalizing on the notion of being the quote-unquote party of freedom, despite the concept of freedom, in his view, is a left-wing idea. He also briefly introduces the claim that the concept of freedom had been perverted by right-wingers by pitting it against equality, which according to the left are both exclusive to each other.
If you live in the United States, you already know who likes to talk about freedom and liberty the most. In the national contest over who gets to represent what values, the Republican Party, and conservatives in general, have monopolized the idea that their politics are the politics of freedom. Leave it to the left to kill our liberty in its fight for equality. We on the right, we stand for our hard-earned freedom. Unfortunately for the right, that couldn't be further from the truth. In this episode, we're going to cover a deeply left-wing idea: freedom. It's pretty common for introductory political classes and videos to differentiate the left and the right by the two values that their discourse seems to essentialize: equality and freedom, and then to pit these two values against each other to explain the conflict of politics. It's all very simple when people are just disagreeing over which value they prefer.
Right on the bat, Second Thought is being deceptive, as conservatives and libertarians do not reject that freedom is exclusive to equality. In fact, we believe that equality is essential for freedom. The liberal perspective on equality that libertarians and conservatives subscribe to is that of the common shared instinct of human nature. Whether someone is of a poor background or of great wealth, black or white, male or female, young or poor, benighted or educated, crippled or abled, what all have in common is the faculty of reason, that all individuals are just that, individuals, self-contained, autonomous beings who inhabit their own consciousness in a way that is truly innatable. And as individuals, we inherit from our human instincts innatable rights. With freedom, it requires respecting the intellectual autonomy of all mankind. Under a free society, it requires a liberal government to regard all human beings as equal under the law on the basis that every individual possesses the same human nature for which they have equal ability to live a virtuous life, and hence are entitled to practice their rights that all men are entitled by birth without the interference by the iron fist of the state. What the quote-unquote right do reject, however, is social equity, and this is because that would require violating negative liberty, which is another concept that's exclusive to freedom. I'll discuss this in greater detail later once we reach the part in which Second Thought tries to elaborate on negative and positive liberty. Second Thought continues on with his anti-Republican tirade by addressing how the GOP likes to present itself as the party of freedom, yet they held positions like being against gay marriage, criminalization of abortion, and maintaining the death penalty. Of course, I don't really care about this argument because 1. Paleoconservatives and Christian reactionaries don't have a monopoly of the title right-wing in the same way tankies don't have a monopoly of being left-wing. And 2, as a member of the libertarian faction of the GOP, I am not a full-blown devout Republican. I will point out, however, that Democrats had these same exact positions on these issues 14 years ago, and I know that Second Thought would obviously respond with the regurgitated Marxist claim that Democrat and Republican parties are two sides of the same coin, that Republicans and Democrats aren't that different from each other, and that Democrats are actually right-wing. Even if that was true, that doesn't disprove that such beliefs and policies aren't exclusive to the right. I'll ask Chapman this: can homophobia exist under socialism? Can Marxists be homophobic? Is the death penalty a prominent form of justice within communist states? Are there any socialists who favor the death penalty, who even are in support of killing capitalists, right-wingers, and fascists if need be to overthrow capitalism or to preserve the socialist state? Can a communist be anti-gay marriage, be against quote-unquote women body choices, and be pro-death penalty, and still be a true Marxist? I know exactly how Second Thought would answer, as these positions and policies are very prevalent in the far-left regimes that Second Thought blindly defends. Despite gay marriage being legal in the United States since 2015, Cuba, Venezuela, China, Vietnam, and all other communist socialist countries have yet to legalize same-sex marriage. This is ironic since it should be expected that countries that proclaim to follow the most progressive ideology, quote-unquote, would be the first to recognize same-sex marriage, yet this is further from the truth. In fact, socialist regimes have a track record of government-sponsored repression towards the LGBT community, whether that be Cuba rounding up suspected homosexuals into concentration camps, Stalin criminalizing homosexuality with a sentence of 5 years of hard labor, or North Korea outright executing same-sex couples for being, quote-unquote, influenced by capitalism from Japan and corrupting public morals. And the majority of these communist states engage in policies that Second Thought associates with the quote-unquote right, such as the death penalty, though put into the extreme in the form of public executions. And although I'm not pro-choice, it should be mentioned that socialist regimes implement policies that repress quote-unquote women's right to choose, either by banning abortion such as in the USSR and communist Romania, or by forcing eugenic abortions against the mother's will, such as in Cuba and China. Although it may seem that I'm making a whataboutery argument here, however, this is not my intent. I do not intend to assert that Second Thought is only against state-sponsored homophobia or the death penalty when right-wingers do it, or that these policies should only be justified under a social society. My point is that positions regarding homosexuality, abortion, or capital punishment are in reality not determined by left-wing or right-wing politics, but rather the progression of public morality. The only reason why we associate LGBT rights, abortions, the abolition of capital punishment with the left is because we associate those with modern-day politics in the West, though granted the debate over gay marriage is a dead issue as it has been legal for like 16 years and Republicans have basically moved on and accepted same-sex marriage as part of American society. Although paleoconservatives associate homosexuality with cultural Marxism, most communists held the perspective that homosexuality was a product of quote-unquote decadence of capitalism and its death throes, and went as far as correlating homosexuality to fascism. The communist attitude towards homosexuals is the reason why most socialist countries took measures in persecuting, arresting, and even executing gays. This is why, to this very day, not a single Marxist nation has legalized same-sex marriage. This is in contrast to the Libertarian Party, which was one of the oldest political parties in America to run on the platform of legalizing gay marriage. Although most Marxists in the US tend to support the LGBT community, abortion, and even open immigration, this attitude is not prevalent among leftists in non-Western countries. As a Puerto Rican, I can tell you for certain that socialists in Latin America, particularly in Puerto Rico, are the most socially conservative people out there. Puerto Rican socialists are extremely anti-abortion as they have long distrust towards Planned Parenthood because of their forced sterilization controversies that date back into the 1970s, and as a result have perceived the pro-choice movement as a gringo-orchestrated plot to ethnically cleanse Puerto Ricans. Homophobia is also rampant within Puerto Rican socialist movements for the same reasons that I pointed out, and are very anti-immigration as they view multiculturalism as an aspect of colonialism. Going back on topic, Second Thought tries to explain the quote-unquote left-wing origins of freedom with a long yet deceptive history lecture of the evolution of political philosophy throughout human civilization. And the lecture part of his video is where Chapman, aka Second Thought, is at his most slimiest when it comes to the delivery of historical facts. It should be mentioned that exploring the roots of left-wing and right-wing politics is the integral part of the overall point of his video. That being freedom is the product of left-wing politics.
Let's explore a history of the left and the right, and the role freedom has played in that history. The use of the terms left and right to designate political families originates with the French Revolution. Back in the late 18th century, France revolted against its monarchy, and when it came time to decide what role the king would play in French society, those who supported the old regime sat on the right side of the National Assembly, and those who supported the revolution and the new republic sat on the left. Conservatives on the right, progressives on the left. Centuries later, as democratic political systems in France and elsewhere became more defined, they borrowed this imprecise terminology to draw rough lines between the conservatives and the progressives who came to represent the core ideas of these two groups: hierarchy on the right, emancipation on the left. This is the origin of the modern left and right, but it is also a stopping point of a longer history of freedom as a political value.
However, Second Thought intentionally didn't clarify something regarding the left-right political roots of the French Revolution. That being the proclaimed quote-unquote left of the French Revolution were actually aligned to what we now refer to as the modern-day right, or in other words, In today's standards, they would be considered libertarians, classical liberals, or even Republicans, well, minus the Christian fundamentalism. Granted, there were different factions, some more radical than others, but one key impact of the revolutionary government was the fistocratic policies of economic liberalization that had replaced the feudalistic system of the previous French regime. The enlightened group of economists known as the Fistocrats, which include the likes of Pierre Samuel Dupont and Jacques Turgot, were one of the many influencers of the Enlightenment and the Atlantic revolutions. Their biggest contribution in early liberal thought was of individualism and laissez-faire economics, believing that government interference in the economy hinders productivity and arguing that the economy should be left alone and allow individuals within the economy to do as they please. The Declaration of Rights of Man even recognized private property as an essential human right. The revolutionary liberal republic lifted the restraints of markets with the abolition of guilds, which for centuries had regulated trade, controlled prices and wages, and held a monopoly in the selling of goods. The revolution also paved the way to meritocracy with the abolition of serfdom and feudalism. In the modern era, we would characterize these thinkers, revolutionaries, and their ideas as being right-wing. This is mainly because unless you live in an oil-rich Middle Eastern country or Southeast Asia, absolute monarchies under an oligarchical system doesn't exist anymore. The feudalistic society that the visionaries of the Enlightenment wanted to rid the West of is no longer present in the current world, with some exceptions, and due to the massive drift of human civilization, the orthodox terminology of right-wing and left-wing has become dated and no longer reflects current politics. Going back into the video, Second Thought goes deeper into human history to explore origins in the meaning of freedom, explaining that liberty was an antonym for slavery, which is true. However, he goes on to define negative and positive liberty, which he does very poorly.
For Aristotle, a founding figure in the long history of political theory, freedom has many parts. In democracies specifically, freedom is both 1. Ruling and being ruled in turn, and 2. The ability to live as one wishes without interference from others. These map quite cleanly to the way we still conceptualize freedom today, in negative and positive terms. Negative freedom usually takes the form of freedom from, as in freedom from obstacles or freedom from coercion. Positive freedoms are freedoms that can be formulated in freedom to statements, like freedom to act upon my free will.
Although he reasonably defines negative liberty, how he describes positive liberty is not so accurate. In fact, freedom to, which according to Chapman is the definition of positive liberty, is actually a component of negative liberty, since by being freed from barriers, one is then free to act on one's free will. For instance, an example of negative liberty is the First Amendment, that being the freedom of speech, which means both the freedom to act, that being the ability to say whatever you want, and freedom from, which is, of course, refers to the freedom from state-sponsored censorship. What positive liberty should be defined as is the capacity to do, or in more philosophical terms, it is the freedom to act in a way to take control of one's own interest. The difference between positive and negative liberty relates to what type of forces one is being freed from. Negative liberty is the absence of external limits, i.e. the government, while positive liberty is the other way around, that being the absence of internal limits. Internal limits can refer to things like income, poverty, disability, ignorance, and desires that hinders one's ability to act in one's interest, though this should not be confused with free will. For there to be positive liberty requires a system of social equity, that being universal healthcare, free education, wealth distribution, etc. Now, for the rest of my response, I'll be elaborating on why positive liberty is an oxymoron, and how in practice, positive liberty results in an unequal and totalitarian society. For one to have positive liberty requires disregarding individual rights. If, for instance, that an individual can't afford the tuition for Harvard University, for his positive liberty to be fulfilled requires to take resources from others, to steal money from someone else that might have been used to pay for their own college education. If the state tries to avoid this by forcing a Harvard professor to teach gender studies for free, that would violate the professor's negative liberty to use his time as he sees fit. Of course, Second Thought would try to make the Robin Hood justification that taxing or stealing from the rich is justified because it is money that they don't need and it should be given to people who desperately need it. However, as demonstrated by the Scandinavian model, it is the middle class, not the 1%, who are being victimized by social equity. This system of redistribution resorts to a government that no longer perceives all citizens as being equal under the law, but rather separate classes, one class that is entitled to state-sponsored privileges, while the other class is burdened to have their own individual freedom stripped away for the benefit of the entitled. There are other issues with positive liberty that I wish to go over in a future video, most notably how positive liberty refrains against free will. Anyway, although we only delve into the tip of the iceberg of Second Thought's video, I'll end part 1 of my response right here. But just you wait for part 2 as I go over the many historical and philosophical inaccuracies contained in his video. In the meantime, please like and share this video, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't so already, please subscribe to my channel. Oh, and remember that all commies are bad.